Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before I introduce my delightful guest this week, I would like to read an excerpt of an essay that she wrote in her column called Life in La La Land. And this particular piece, titled Borrowed Memories Bring a Father Back to Life, were published in both the Intelligencer and Bucks County Courier Times. So I'm going to read a small excerpt to set the tone for our conversation today. This is a piece about her father's death. When one of my aunts suggests she'd like to collect some of our memories for the eulogy she will deliver, I agree to help her edit them, but balk when she asks for my own. As tears fill my eyes, she apologizes for upsetting me, not realizing, she says, such a task would make me emotional. But the truth, the one I don't admit, is I cannot find any to share. Yes, there are moments I've savored from my visits, the quiet companionship of strolling the beach with him at sunset, the communion of meal times, even the simple gesture of slipping my hand into his as we navigated the sweltering bustle of a day in town. But the stories that would vitally bring him to life, rebuild him from the wreckage of loneliness and lassitude, those seem to have vanished. And so I tuck close the sketches of others like alms from my withered mind's eye. Now I'm going to skip ahead to the end of this piece. My father was an amazing man, she says, reminding me he would want me to be remembered for his exuberance. For now, the more immediate past pins me, but I take comfort in the memories of those who knew him at his brightest, certain he burns even more brilliantly now. And grateful that even in his last moments, his body weak and racked with pain, it was that light which stunned me, his true and perfect essence flickering till the end. I'd like to welcome my guest and just beautiful, talented writer, Naila Francis. She is a grief coach. She's a writer, a poet, and an ordained minister. Naila, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh my gosh, Susan, thank you so much for having me. What an honor. And your voice reading that piece, it transported me right back there, actually.
Well,
Thank you.
I was so taken with your writing. I had the opportunity to read a bunch of your gorgeous pieces that I know you said were published when you had your own column in La La Land, which I love so much. And so my listeners know too that I am also a grief and loss coach and have written my way through grief. And I want you to kind of talk to our listeners about who you are and then talk about your writing. And maybe actually before we go there, talk to us about your losses, because I know you've had two significant losses that you and I had a chance to talk about before we started the recording.
Of course. Yeah. So I would say first that I am a grieving daughter. And I say that kind of astonished that this will be 10 years since my dad died. I can't even believe we're getting to that mark, but I think that loss will always define me. And so I will always be a grieving daughter. I'm also, like you said, a writer. For many, many years, I was a journalist. I actually trained to be a journalist. That's what I studied in college. I thought I would be a lifelong journalist, and clearly life had other plans for me. I'm also a poet. Poetry has been hugely vital to me in my grief journey of working with others, but also finding soothing and nurturing and healing for myself. And I am an interfaith minister and a grief coach and a death midwife, but primarily still focusing on grief as a death midwife.
Yeah. So talk to us about your dad passed and he was your stepfather.
Well, they weren't together, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, he really was like a father to me, my mom's partner. Yeah. Yeah.
I want you to share kind of this juxtaposition, right, between being there for your dad at the end of his life and that relationship that you had with him that was not, all rainbows and sunshine. And then this man, Lou, who really acted as a stepdad, and how suddenly you lost him and
Yeah.
sort of within a year of each other. I'd love for you just to sort of share that part of your journey before we jump into kind of our grief and loss conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So my parents separated when I was in college, just heading to college. And my mom became friends with this man, Lou. My parents, I should say, had a very tumultuous marriage. The ending was very traumatic and very painful, not amicable in the least. And so when my mom became friends with Lou, I feel like Lou stepped into her life when she really needed somebody to hold her. And I'm not even talking in the romantic sense or physical sense, but just somebody who could show up for her with kindness and compassion and really listen. Like I remember her saying in those early days, that was one of the amazing things. He would just sit and listen, and she felt like she could tell him anything. So he came to be for me like an angel who showed up in all of our lives when we didn't even know that we needed one. I have a younger brother. He's 2 years younger than I am. And I feel like we were all kind of adrift after my parents ended their marriage. And Lou turned out to be a very steady, gentle, kind presence in our lives, even though I sort of resisted that presence because I didn't want him to take my dad's place. I had this whole story in my head about, well, men are only going to disappoint you anyway because of my history with my dad. And so I didn't really want to trust him and let him in because in my head, he was just going to disappear anyway. But he just kept showing up, like never forcing himself on any of us, never trying to be a father figure, but at all the key moments, like buying a car, me graduating from high school, graduating from college, like having big decisions to make. And then like really small moments too. Like he was always, I used to love cinnamon buns before I went gluten-free. He was always bringing me cinnamon buns on Valentine's Day when I was single. He would bring my mom flowers. He would bring me flowers. Like he just was a very, very sweet man. So there was really such a gentleness about his spirit. And in 2011, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And the week we found out he had pancreatic cancer was the week he died. So I didn't get to say goodbye to him. I often think he knew he had cancer. And in that very loving, protective way of his, he just didn't want to burden us with that. Because I often think back to the last time I had lunch with him. It was my birthday, and he would die a little over a month after that. But I just remember the last hug that he gave me and the last time he put his hand on my hand, and how there was something so extra warm about that. Like I was wondering, I often go back and think like, gosh, did he know? Did he know that might have been the last time? And so that was like my first big grief initiation. I had lost grandparents before that, but because they were in St. Lucia and I was living in the US and they weren't so much a part of my everyday life, like I don't think I really even understood what grief was or how I should have felt about them when those deaths happened. So Lou died. And then a year later, a little more than a year later, but in 2012, my dad died. And he actually had also been really sick with cancer, but he had had health issues plaguing him for about a decade, like heart attack, cancer, a really bad car accident that could have paralyzed him. So he had been through a lot, but I always kind of thought of my dad as Lazarus, like he just kept rising back from each new catastrophe. So I kind of came to think of him as invincible and would always be there and bounce back. But he succumbed to cancer. And I was able to be with him when he died in the hospital. So he was in St. Lucia. And I will say that my dad and I had a very complex, sometimes conflicted relationship because of the way my parents' marriage ended. There was a lot there that I struggled to accept around his choices and his behavior. So our relationship was often very strained, but we really, really loved each other. We always knew that we loved each other. And that was kind of like the undergirding of our relationship, despite all of this. So I feel like when he was dying, the fact that I was able to be there with him in the hospital for those last 4 days, it was like I was meant to be there. I was meant to be there to really begin healing our relationship, because that time did feel so healing for me. Because, I mean, the first thing he said when I showed up at the hospital was, "I'm on the way out." So when he said that, like, what else could I do but just be open to loving him? This wasn't the time for me to be like, "Oh my God, Dad, I've been waiting for you to, like, acknowledge all these things that you've done. And like, Dad, like, you need to ask my forgiveness for this." Like, I just felt like it was just a time for me to just be there and be present to the love between us.
I just thank you for that. I want to take a breath. I was still back at Lou holding your hand the last time you saw him, as though somewhere inside of you, you could never have known, but you felt the specialness and the warmth of that last touch that you had from him, which was just, I could feel that when you were talking about it. I want to go back though to your parents split. Lou came into your life. What was your relationship like with your father after that divorce? How did you navigate that relationship? And did your mom and your dad maintain a friendship? I just want to give myself and readers some context prior to your dad's death.
Yeah. So my parents, so we're from St. Lucia originally, my family, but I have lived in the US since I was 10 years old. My parents moved us here when I was a kid. And after my parents split up, my dad went back to St. Lucia. So there was like physical distance between us that made it harder to sustain a relationship. But I think the emotional distance was even more challenging, because he really, I mean, he just did some things that were so incredibly painful and refused to own up to any of them. And I feel like I spent so much of our relationship just waiting for and longing for some kind of acknowledgement of that. And then for him to sort of take steps towards not just like reconciling everything that had happened, but his own healing, because he was very, very stuck in the past. And, like thinking about, I think he didn't want to acknowledge what he'd done, but at the same time, he couldn't let go of the relationship that he'd had with my mom and always wanting it and kind of ruminating on things. And like, he was just so stuck in the past. And that really made it hard for me to relate to him.
Were you having regular contact with him? Did you shut him out of your life for a while? Like, what was happening? Because those were very, I mean, you were young, you were in high school when this was going on, right? So sort of like that transition into your adulthood and college and all of those years, what was going on between you and your dad?
So we would talk to each other maybe once a week on the phone. There were a couple times I did go to St. Lucia to see him. He didn't really come to the US for visits, but I feel like a lot of times our conversations were strained from my end of things. Like, and I really wanted so badly to have like a normal relationship with him where I could share of myself. My brother had more of that for whatever reason, their own journey, but I just never felt like I could just pick up the phone and be like, "Dad, you won't believe what happened today," and like tell him this great thing, or "Dad, I'm so sad. Like this, I just really need you to listen to this." Like that was always my mom for me, but I really, really wanted that. with my dad. I mean, there's a poem that I read after he died, and it was something about like grief being the long, long loneliness of missing a touch you never knew you wanted. And that's how I always think of our relationship, like just so much that I wanted that I didn't get. So when he died, I was grieving as much the relationship we didn't have as the one that we did.
Okay, this is such a beautiful segue into where I want to go. But before I traverse into that land of grief, I want to ask you, so you had this sounds like a special relationship with Lou and this tumultuous relationship with your dad, but it was important. It sounds like that you kept the relationship with your dad going, right? Because he was your dad. Because I think that it would have been easy, especially as a teenager or a young 20-something-year-old, to be so angry that your dad was not showing up as this dad that you thought should be there for you, that you could have slammed that door in his face. Young people do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah.
when their parents split. It's a lot easier to do that because, you've got your relationship with your mom. Then you had Lou come in and he sort of, fulfilled that sort of stepfather role. But yet, this relationship with your father was important enough. What did you do with this anger? You were this, I'm imagining passionate because you're a writer. And I can just tell in a minister and a poet that you're a passionate human. Like, what were you doing with all of this passion that I'll call anger towards your dad?
Yes, that is a very good question. I channeled some of that into a very destructive romantic partnership, I will say. Yeah, I had one of those. I always call it my epic disaster of a relationship. It was like this crazy on and off 5-year thing where I definitely think I was trying to work out some of those issues I had with my dad there. Sometimes the anger would come out with my dad, and it was very startling to me when it happened. Like, I remember one Christmas calling to wish him Merry Christmas. And I probably sent him like a shirt and a tie for Christmas or something. And he started telling me how he would have preferred a camera or whatever else he was saying. And I just lost it and started screaming at him on the phone because I was just like, the ingratitude, like, who does that? Like, I didn't have to send you anything. And you're telling me like all the other things that I could have. And I screamed and I hung up the phone on him. And I don't even remember what happened after that, like how we eventually found our way back. But that moment always stands out to me as being a very clear moment of anger. And also, like, when Lou died, because obviously he was not a fan of Lou, he was just making ridiculous requests of me. And I was just like, Lou just died. I cannot entertain this. Like, what are you doing? So there were moments that the anger came out, but I honestly don't think I really started working through my anger until after he died and I went to therapy.
Okay, so let's
Yeah.
go there because, you know, I write about this a lot, our anger and our guilt and some of the other debilitating emotions that can follow a death, depending on our relationship, on how they died, right? There's all of these circumstances. And I understand that grief is grief, but I do think we can get into some pretty complex grief, depending on how complex our relationship was and what happened at the time of death, right? Did we get to say goodbye? Did we not say goodbye? Were we estranged? Were we not estranged, et cetera? And so you're being very articulate in terms of like this anger that you held for your dad, but you also had this love for him, right? This deep love for your dad that you chose to keep that door open, even though you would become enraged with him. So here you are. It's at the end of his death. You are with him. Was your brother there as well, or were you alone?
No, I was there with some of his siblings and a cousin, but my brother had been to see him that summer. So it
Okay.
was just me. Yeah.
So here you are, and you said to me, you said earlier that you were able somehow, not everybody can do this, by the way, Naila, I'm sure you know that, like you were able just to be present in the last few days of his life. But you said, what else could I do? Well, I can think of a lot of things that people do.
True. Very true. Yes.
You did not. And so, because of course I've worked with people, clients and whatnot, that have held on to anger decades after the death of the person that they've lost. And of course,
Yeah.
the only person hurting from that burden is us, right? I mean, the person who is dead is free and happy and all of those things. We, on the other hand, are dragging around a pretty heavy weight. Were you a minister at that time or no? Did that come later?
I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that speaks volumes in terms of like who you are as a human. And I would love to know that you were able to put that anger aside, be there with your father, and then talk to us about this healing journey that you went on after. Because I know, as I tell people, grief is messy. It is not a pretty process, but necessary, I think, if we're willing to do that work.
Yeah.
Talk to us what that looked like for you.
Yeah. So it's actually so fitting that you chose to open with that excerpt from that essay of mine, because it really speaks to the messiness of it. And like, I really struggled in the days after he died, planning a funeral, my aunt writing the eulogy, like hearing so many people tell stories of my dad and feeling like everybody had this version of my dad that I never got. And that was so painful to me. I was like, how was he this like generous, kind, loving? Like one of the stories somebody told was how he would go to the market on Saturday mornings, like before all the vendors opened shop, and he would walk around with like a flask of tea and like offer tea to the vendors. And I was just like, who is this person? Like, that's not the dad I know. So it was really hard for me to reconcile the father I had with all these wonderful stories people wanted to rush forward to tell me. And that made it painful. That made it painful when my aunt was ready to write the eulogy. And I was like, I don't have a story to share. I don't know what to tell you. And that's also where some of the anger, I think, started to get really triggered in me, because I was just pissed. Like, well, that was not my dad. I don't even know who you're talking about. And I remember, my brother, and he had a very different relationship with my dad. So I could more appreciate that, like trying to steer me towards that, like hold on to the good memories. And that was another thing that would really irritate me after he died, when so many people kept saying, hold on to the good memories. And I'm like, do you know the relationship I had with my dad? Like, what good memories are you talking about? And my brother was trying to steer me in that direction and be like, he is at peace and all these things. And I was just angry. And I remember him like saying to me once, so what, you're just going to be angry now? Like, that's it. And I'm like, well, I'm going to be angry for as long as I need to be angry. I don't know how long that's going to take. And I was in a relationship at the time with somebody I thought would be my forever person. And that ended up really falling apart the year after my dad died, even though he was like amazing when my dad died, like flew down to St. Lucia, and he'd never met my dad, like ended up being a pallbearer in the funeral, all this stuff. But as that relationship was falling apart, I was thinking, gosh, I really need to go to therapy to figure out what I'm doing here in this partnership. And it turned out I really needed to go to therapy to work on my relationship with my dad. Like, the demise of that relationship got me there, but most of my sessions and my time in therapy ended up being about that. And it was really my therapist that helped me see that so much of what I had been waiting for, like so much of the tension in my relationship with my dad, had been waiting for him to offer something that he never gave. And that was where a lot of my anger was coming from. And that really started to shift things for me. Just being able to see that, and also being able to talking to some family members who shared his story as a child and the challenges he had growing up, and then coming to see more of how he turned out to be the person that he was, also helped me in sort of processing and releasing that anger. And then I did a 6-week writing workshop with a poet whose daughter had been murdered. And so she was offering writing courses to help people work through their grief. And that was like huge. I mean, I would write these things and I would just cry after I wrote them. And that was so cathartic for me to do that. And I also worked with an energy healer at the time. I mean, I was like, okay, what do I need to do here to like get myself through this? And there were some sessions where I could just feel so much energy moving through me. And she would be like, there's a quiet room upstairs. If you need to go in there and just cry, just go do that. And I would go upstairs and I would just sit there on the floor and I would just sob and let myself have that. So I tried as much as I could to be present to my emotions. I mean, sometimes I don't think I was really super conscious of it. I really think I was just kind of like going with the wave of, okay, this sounds like a good idea right now. Maybe I need to take this class. Oh, maybe I do need some energy healing. Like maybe like I often say like if you're faithful to your grief, it'll really take you where you need to go and teach you what you need to know. And that's what I felt like I was doing.
And completely transform your life.
Yeah.
On one of these podcasts, I've had some really amazing guests on, and, how grief can really awaken the dead parts of who we are. And the really ugly stuff comes up for us, right? But in that hole, whatever that hole is filled with, whether it's grief, it's anger, it's sadness, it's disappointment, like all of these things. But in that hole, when we really do our work and really, really are present, as you said, to our grief, it's amazing the miracles that will bloom in that space. And, I wrote 2 dissertations on writing through the healing benefits of writing through grief and loss long before I met my brother, before I lost my brother. And I'm curious to hear the energy work. I mean, I think of mind, body, spirit, and you tackled all of those areas, right? Like you got the help on all of those different levels, which is remarkable. And that's grief work, right? I mean, you really went for it, and it's terrifying to do that work. I think that anger and sadness are 2 sides of the same coin. One's external, one's internal, right? And so I want to hear what happened when you walked through that anger, that deep anger. What was waiting for you on the other side? Was that sadness that you finally were able to tap into? So, because the anger is the obvious, right? When you want to just like really take a big rock and you want to smash windows. You want to break things. That's the only thing I can think of when my brother died. I wanted to break things because and anger can be that, whether it's metaphorical breaking things, like it really does feel like your life is shattering in this violent kind of way when we feel that depth of anger. So I would love to hear your story of when you were able to kind of really move through that anger.
Definitely the sadness, which, it's funny that you ask that because I often say that to people a lot in my grief coaching. Like, usually once you break through the anger, that's where the real sadness is. And yeah, I think breaking through the anger is where I really began to touch the intense grief of losing my dad.
Okay, so when you were able to break through that anger and touch the intense grief, and I love that language, what was that experience like for you? Was it surprising? Was it terrifying? Was it shocking? What was that, if you could put words to it?
It was definitely terrifying at times. I get why people so often avoid grief because, I mean, once you go there, it's like, oh my God, will I ever be happy again? Will I just be stuck here in this loop of like wailing and feeling like hopeless and all these other feelings, forever? And so there were definitely moments where it was terrifying and also like feeling so not like myself because I am someone who's usually very ebullient and joyful and lighthearted. And, I remember I was a journalist at the time and my editor, I walked in one day and he was just like lifting his arms up. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, you're just so down all the time. Like, I'm trying to get you to smile. And it was like, my dad's dead. I don't know what you want from me. And at the same time, like just recognizing like, wow, this is a side of Naila that who knew she could be here. Cause yeah, I did feel like I was somehow someone else. And that was disconcerting at times.
And I've said this numerous times, it's exactly how I feel because I too love to laugh. And I think that when you're this very sad person, it scares people, right? It scares people in your world because they're like, oh my God, if Naila can be bummed out, what does that mean for me? Even if that's not a conscious feeling, right? Because to be in someone's pain and suffering is equally scary for the person who's holding that space for the griever, because we know we're going to die. We know we're going to lose people that we love, but God, don't make me look at it if I don't have to, because it's so frightening to be in that dark space.
Yeah. And to not know like when you would emerge or how or if even. Yeah.
So what did that look like for you? And if you could put some time around this too for our listeners, because I think one of the scariest things when we're grieving is that we're never going to feel joyful again. You know, it's a very frightening thing to think, oh, is this my life now? I'm just going to be sad. And it's just going to be like someone pulled a shade down on the sun. And I'm never, ever going to feel that warmth of life again.
Yeah. So I mean, there were definitely moments of joy. Like there were moments where I would be laughing and then all of a sudden it would strike me like, oh my gosh, you're laughing, but you're grieving. Like, how is this possible that these two things are happening at the same time? But I think it would take me maybe about a year and a half when I started to feel a little bit more like myself. And, you know, a lot of that first year of grieving my dad was also spent sort of extricating myself from the relationship I was in. So I was grieving my dad. And then, so my dad died in 2012. And then like the end of 2013 was when I finally left that relationship. So it was a lot.
Wow.
Like I just felt like there was so much heaviness and darkness and confusion and not knowing how my life was going to shake out. I would say by 2014, I started to sort of come out of that and really feel more like myself. And then in 2015, one of my dreams for like ever had been to go to Africa and volunteer in some way with kids in Africa. And I mean, I'd been talking about it and dreaming about it and planning it and just never knowing how I would get there. And then in 2015, I finally decided to go. And that trip just changed my life. And I felt like, I don't even want to say it brought me back to myself. It almost opened me to myself in a way that I didn't know was waiting to bloom, if that makes sense. Like I remember ending my relationship and I was still, you know, really in love with him, but I just knew that it wasn't the right thing for me. And wondering like, where does the love go? Like when you're done in a partnership like this, but there's still so much love, where does it go? And going to Tanzania, it was like, oh, this is where that love is meant to go, into all these kids. I'm supposed to pour it. And so all that love of like missing my dad, missing this relationship, all of that, I felt like I finally had an outlet for it and a place to channel it. And I just felt so alive being there in a way that I hadn't in a long time. That I think was when I really began to, I don't want to say come out of my grief journey because we're always on the journey, but to really shift in a way that was like, okay, now I can start to carry it instead of like walking like forever burdened under the weight of it.
I have a couple of things to say. I love this because I have this saying on my desk that grief is love with no place to go. And I always add to that quote, until we choose to pour that love into something else or in someone else.
Yeah.
You know, like a new receptacle for our love. But the other thing was my husband a couple of weeks ago came home and said, I want to go to Tanzania. And I just like yeah. And when you said it, I was like, okay, I always believe in signs from my brother. I'm like, is this supposed to be funny? Like, it's so random, right? Like,
yes,
because we talked about going to Africa. I'm like, what is going on right now? Anyway, I wrote it down because apparently I'm gonna have to go. But is that bizarre?
that is very bizarre. Oh my God.
That is just so bizarre because everybody knows like I love signs. And I wanted to say something that hit me this morning. And now I know why it came to me this morning. And I can't wait to ask you this question. But I kept hearing, fly to freedom. And I heard this like, be forgiving, be loving, be you, fly, right? That's sort of the acronym. And so I was like, that's such a weird thought to have this morning. But listening to you, I'm thinking, when did she make that shift of forgiveness for your father? Because we know forgiveness really is never about the other person, right? It goes back to the burdens that we carry and that anger and those grudges that we hang on to, whether we are aware of it or not, weigh us down. They keep us stuck in ways that sometimes we are not aware of. So I'm struck by a couple of things because there was a shift for you when you moved through the anger and got to this place of sadness with your dad. And then when you took this trip, you said it opened you up to a part of you that you didn't know existed. For some reason, I feel, are those connected? The connection between the forgiveness that came at some point with your dad and the willingness to open yourself up to a part of you that I've got chills. So I just thought I would throw it out. I don't know if it's landing on you or not.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting because I've never thought about it in that context or like connected them. And I don't know that there's like a moment or even a stage where I was like, okay, I've forgiven my dad. But I felt like that trip opened my heart so wide that there was room for so much more in there that included forgiveness. And I also remember feeling my dad with me on the trip and feeling his joy and his pride, which was huge because when I would talk to him about going to Tanzania, or well, I didn't even know I would end up in Tanzania. I was always just like somewhere in Africa. He was kind of a naysayer. He was just kind of like, well, that's so far away, or it's so hard, or how are you going to do it? Like, which would be really upsetting to me. So then to be there and to feel him being so proud, like that did really, I think, help with forgiving him.
I know we're at the top of the hour now, but I've got a few more questions.
Yeah, that's okay.
Because we chatted a little bit before we started recording. I want to know the work that you did with your father, because I feel like listening to that the grief work allowed this expansion in your heart, that somehow this grief work opened you up to these pieces that, as you said, you didn't even know were there.
Yeah.
When was your trip to Africa?
It was in 2015 was my first time. And then I actually went back twice after that.
Talk to us about how your life has expanded through the grief work and these trips. Like I am trying to pull as much out of you as I can because this story is so powerful, but like in a tangible way, like returning to your home. How has it changed your relationships, like with friendships or anywhere in your life? I want to hear just how this has impacted all areas of your life.
I feel like grief is which may sound so odd to some people listening, but it has a very enlivening energy to it. And I feel like everything I've done since my dad died has kind of come from that place. Like I often say, okay, I have done the hardest thing I've had to do in my life, which was say goodbye to my dad. So here's this other thing that I'm thinking of doing. Well, I've done the hardest thing, so maybe I can do this too, which was how I felt about Tanzania. For so long, it just seemed this unreachable goal. And then I decided to do it. And I felt like that opened up so much. And even when I left my job as a journalist, I had no plans on leaving. I loved writing my column. I was an arts and entertainment reporter. I loved doing that. The paper all of a sudden decided that they wanted to make me a municipal school board reporter. And I literally said, if you make me do this, my soul will shrivel. And I just quit without like having a plan or like knowing what would happen next. And I just feel like there's been sort of this sense of like wanting to live more authentically, wanting to live more expansively, wanting the choices I make to matter. I mean, I had no idea I would become a grief coach and death midwife when my dad died. I didn't even know these things existed. But when I found them, I remember like I usually get this whole body rush when something feels right to me. And I remember just being like, oh my gosh, this is it. I have to do this. This is like so what I'm doing next. And so just following that shiver of aliveness that I think lives within our grief is really what has transformed my life.
I don't know if you've written about that, but follow the shiver of aliveness that lives within our grief. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
really, really, really beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll ask you my closing question that I ask everybody. And you've been speaking to this throughout this interview, but what does self-love look like for you now?
Making space for the all of me, like making space for everything, the joy, the grief, the loneliness, the longing, the like being able to hold it all and hold myself very gently and tenderly in all the layers of me.
Thank you so much. I can't believe it's been an hour. It feels like time is suspended or something.
I know. Like we were in an alternate universe.
I know. It's really bizarre. Well, everyone is going to want to know where to find you. So where can we find you? We'll have all of this in the show notes as well.
Yes. So I am at thishallowedwilderness.com is my website, hallowed, HALLOWED wilderness. And my Instagram is at this hallowed wilderness and same for Facebook.
And I really encourage you all to get on her website and to read her writings. They are profound. They are beautiful. I know I got lost in them. Your language is stunning. And so I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Oh my gosh, Susan, thank you so much. What a joy. It's funny. I often laugh at myself because I'm like, who gets so excited to talk about grief? What a joy to chat with you.
It's funny that you say that because I'm like, I do have so much fun on this podcast. And it's just such a strange thing. I'm like, I love my podcast on grief and loss. I love talking about dead people because, I want people to know the levity does come back. And those that have passed they are joyful. They are living in a state of joy. And I often see my brother who had this gorgeous smile and this twinkle when something silly happens to me, like if it's irritating or an inconvenience, I often just see him laughing in the corner. And so my mom died 2 years ago and he died, 8 years ago now. But, my girlfriend just asked me yesterday, do you miss your mom? And I'm like, gosh, I talk to my mom and brother every single day. And of course I have these moments of, I want to just hug them. I want them to be here physically. And so, as you said, you can hold everything at one time. You can hold the joy. You can hold the sadness. It's not an or, it's always an and. It's always an and.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. Live life in the end.
Yeah. Live life in the and. La la land. All right, guys, I want to thank you all for listening. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And we'll see you here again next week.